It all began with a lock. Not a broken window, not a lawsuit, and certainly no loud banging on my door. Just a cheap silver padlock slapped onto the gate of my dock, like a petty jab from the universe. I stood there, coffee in hand, staring at it, my mind reeling, as though the lock had personally wronged me. And, in a way, it had. That dock was more than just a stretch of wood. It was the soul of my lakeside retreat, the one place where I could escape to, paddle my canoe, teach my nephew how to fish, and occasionally enjoy a glass of scotch while pretending to write a novel. Now, it was locked up, not by a thief or the local authorities, but by the HOA. Specifically, a woman named Sarah, who had recently moved up from office assistant to the high and mighty title of Chief Compliance Officer for Lakeside Properties. I called the HOA office, hoping it was just an oversight. Maybe they thought the dock was part of the shared lakeshore, or there had been a mistake in the lot numbers. But no, Sarah herself picked up the phone, her voice drenched in overly sweet professionalism. She told me that, due to recent complaints about unauthorized activities on the dock, the HOA had decided to tighten up the rules regarding dock use. Apparently, my solo canoeing counted as an unauthorized activity, and despite the dock being on my deeded land, it was now subject to compliance reviews. I asked who had complained. She told me it was confidential. I asked who had authorized the lock. She said the board had voted unanimously. I asked when this vote had taken place. She hung up. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, a laminated notice had been affixed to the dock gate, warning of fines for tampering with HOA property. On Thursday morning, a patrol SUV cruised by. Yes, our HOA has a real patrol vehicle, complete with magnetic decals, and driven by a retired officer named Bob. It rolled by at 6:43 a.m. while I sat drinking coffee and staring at the lake. Bob didn't say a word. He just nodded at the dock as if it were a hostage and he was the one guarding the ransom. Now, I'm not the type to react impulsively. I don't yell or argue. I prefer to plan, observe, and most importantly, read bylaws. And oh, did I read the bylaws. Page after page of vague, overreaching nonsense written by people who treat property management like a military campaign. But deep within that legal swamp, I found it. Section 8.9.3c. It stated that any HOA-imposed restriction on private deeded lakeside property required the owner's signed consent unless there was an immediate environmental threat or a clear danger to community safety. In other words, unless my dock was burning or filled with pirates, they had no legal basis to interfere. But I didn't confront them, not yet, because Sarah didn't operate on logic, she thrived on optics. She loved winning in front of an audience. She was all about drama. So I gave her a show. That Saturday, I threw a barbecue. Just a few friends, some music, and a giant banner that read, "Unauthorized Recreational Gathering, BYO Lawn Chair." We didn't step foot on the dock, of course, but we made sure to stay close enough for HOA members to squint suspiciously from across the cove. I made sure someone was live streaming just in case Bob showed up. And sure enough, he did. And when Bob realized we weren't technically breaking any rules, he left, radioing something about keeping an eye out for escalation. Sunday morning came, and with it, the lock was gone. But in its place wasn't freedom, it was a new lock. Bigger and shinier, and this time a steel cable wrapped around the gate like a constricting snake. Alongside it was a second laminated notice, citing Section 7.2.4, Emergency Interim Control Measures Pending Full Board Review. They were making it up as they went, so I did the same. On Monday, I installed a 12-foot wooden sign right next to the dock, visible from every angle of the lake. The sign featured a very realistic hand-painted crocodile mid-lunge, its mouth wide open and eyes gleaming with hunger. Beneath it, in large red block letters, it read, Warning: aggressive crocodile activity detected in this area. Do not approach the waterline. I made sure the lettering matched the county's standard wildlife alert design. I even added a QR code linking to a perfectly legitimate environmental report from Australia. That evening, 3 paddleboarders from the HOA Facebook group floated by and came to a complete stop. They squinted at the sign. One pulled out binoculars and another turned back. A few hours later, I received a message from a neighbor asking if I'd heard about a crocodile sighting. I told him I couldn't confirm anything, but I had been hearing strange splashes at night. By Tuesday morning, the HOA issued a lake-wide advisory warning residents not to swim or fish until further notice. Deborah sent out an email blast about potential non-native species threats and postponed the monthly board kayaking mixer. By Thursday, someone had reported hearing hissing near the reeds. That's when a wildlife official came to visit and politely asked if I had seen anything. I showed him my sign. He sighed, snapped a picture, and said, this will probably get me called into a town hall meeting, right? I offered him a burger, and we sat there watching the lake together for 20 minutes.
Nothing came of it. Bob left and never returned. Meanwhile, the HOA's paranoia continued to grow. They hired a private firm to scan the shoreline with drones. They even shut down the community pool out of an abundance of caution, which made absolutely no sense. Sarah scheduled a town hall for an urgent ecological discussion. I RSVP'd with a question. Will this include updates on the illegal seizure of private docks? She did not respond. Saturday arrived like the final act of an old Western. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, and every folding chair was filled. Sarah stood at the front in a coral blouse that clashed with her mood. She launched into a PowerPoint presentation about environmental risks, rising crocodile sightings across the country, and the need for proactive measures. When it came time for public comments, I raised my hand. I thanked Sarah for her concern and for the HOA's swift action in the face of aquatic danger. Then I read Section 8.9.3c aloud, slowly, like I was reciting scripture. I finished with, "Therefore, any restriction placed on my dock without my signed consent is invalid, including that lock. Unless, of course, you can prove my dock is a direct threat to the community." The room fell completely silent. Sarah's nostrils flared, and she muttered something about pending legal clarification. I offered to provide the clarification myself, free of charge. That night, someone cut the cable lock. I didn't touch it, didn't need to. Sunday morning, I watched from my porch as Bob approached the dock with bolt cutters. He stared at the crocodile sign, sighed like a man who regretted every decision since retirement, and snipped the cable. He left the gate open. No ticket, no warning, just quiet resignation. But the crocodile sign, I left it up. Not because I expected a gator to crawl out of the reeds, but because I had learned something vital about HOA psychology.
I also added a footnote offering to remove the sign the moment a certified wildlife biologist confirmed the absence of crocodile activity in the lake. Until then, I explained, I was simply exercising my right to protect myself and others from potential hazards, as outlined in Section 5.3.1, Individual Safety Discretion. The next morning, someone egged my mailbox. I didn't see it happen, but I had a pretty good guess. And the timing was too perfect, considering that it was the same morning I received an anonymous invitation to a special session of the HOA board to address my recent behavioral misconduct. It was clearly meant to look official. Sarah even forged the HOA seal. But the location was the clubhouse kitchen, which wasn't an approved meeting space, and the time was set for 7:15 a.m. on a Wednesday, when most people are either asleep or commuting. I showed up anyway. I wore a Hawaiian shirt, brought a large thermos of black coffee, and arrived 5 minutes early. Sarah was already there. flanked by two of her favorite board members, Jenna and Olivia, both of whom wore that brittle, pursed-lipped expression of people who use the phrase, "standards must be upheld," as though it's a religion. They were seated at a folding table, surrounded by a yellow legal pad, a box of pastries, and 3 name placards. Mine was labeled Resident Guest. Sarah began with a monologue. She said the board was gravely concerned about the spread of misinformation in the neighborhood. She mentioned a recent drop in paddleboard rentals, canceled family outings, and a viral post on the community Facebook page that speculated about reptilian nesting habits. She blamed it all on my sign. She accused me of weaponizing artistic expression for psychological manipulation. I thanked her for the compliment. She didn't laugh. Instead, she handed me a printed resolution demanding I remove the sign within 24 hours or face escalating consequences. I looked it over, then calmly pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. Inside was a notarized affidavit from my neighbor across the cove, Jack, a retired Coast Guard officer with a degree in marine biology. Jack's statement explained that while he couldn't confirm crocodile presence, he had observed unusual wake activity near my dock, consistent with a large submerged animal. He concluded that a temporary warning sign was a reasonable safety measure under the circumstances. I handed it to Sarah and took a long sip of coffee. She read it. Her face froze. Her eyes flicked to Jenna, then Olivia. Neither of them spoke. The silence lingered. I broke it. "I'll be happy to remove the sign," I said, "if the board can present a more qualified expert to contradict Mr. Holloway's assessment. I'll even pay for the evaluation. Until then, I believe we're done here." I walked out, thermos still in hand. By that afternoon, the HOA Facebook page was flooded with theories. Some believed the croc was real. Some said I made it up. One guy suggested I imported it from Florida using Amazon Prime. But the important thing was that everyone was talking about it. And in HOA politics, perception is power. Sarah must have realized she'd lost control of the narrative, because her next move was theatrical, even by her standards. 2 days later, she organized a Lake Safety Awareness Day. Flyers were on every porch. A banner hung from the clubhouse deck. There was even a bouncy castle. But the real reason she did it was for the symbolic removal of the crocodile sign, which she planned to live stream. Except she never got the chance to remove it because someone else beat her to it. That morning, I walked down to the dock and found the sign missing. In its place was a bright red poster with bold block letters that read, "Thank you, HOA, for protecting us from dangerous animals, especially the ones in charge."
It was stapled to a wooden stake and surrounded by tiny plastic alligator toys. Clearly, someone was having fun, but not Sarah. She showed up 20 minutes later with Bob and 2 clipboard-carrying volunteers. Her face was the exact shade of a ripe tomato, and the moment she saw the parody sign, she yanked it from the ground like it had personally offended her ancestors. She shouted something about vandalism. Bob looked uncomfortable. I just stood on my porch, arms folded, sipping lemonade. Sarah called an emergency board meeting that night. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have guessed, is that in the weeks I'd spent reading bylaws, I'd also dug into board election procedures, and I discovered something fascinating. A petition signed by 15% of HOA members could trigger a vote of no confidence, and that vote, if successful, could force a special election to replace any sitting board member. I did the math. We had 86 voting households. I needed 13 signatures. I got 27. Because as much as people rolled their eyes at HOA politics, they hated Sarah Miller. Not because of the crocodile drama, but because of everything else she'd ever done. Issuing fines for crooked garden gnomes, banning basketball hoops, threatening to tow a teenager's bike for aesthetic reasons. My sign was just the excuse they needed. By the time the next board meeting rolled around, the clubhouse was packed, not with HOA loyalists, but with lakefront owners, young families, and retirees who were sick of Sarah's reign. I handed the petition to the board secretary. She counted the signatures twice, then looked at Sarah and said, "We have to honor it." For once, Sarah was speechless. But the real twist came 2 days later when I got a call from a man named Jason. He introduced himself as the father of one of the HOA volunteers, someone who had helped with Lake Safety Awareness Day. He said his daughter had been forced to attend after school and that Sarah had screamed at her for misaligning the banner. Then he said something that made me stop cold. She's not just running this HOA like a dictator. She's breaking actual state regulations. When I asked what he meant, he told me to check the financials. The HOA's financial records weren't exactly classified, but they also weren't easy to get by design. Like most HOAs, ours had a resident portal that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. Password resets required 2 separate email confirmations and inexplicably a phone call. Once inside, you had to navigate through 6 nested tabs just to find last year's budget. But thanks to Jason's tip, I knew exactly what to look for. The first thing I noticed was that lakefront maintenance and security had ballooned by over 400% in the past fiscal year. There were vague line items like safety initiatives, incident response measures, and my personal favorite, unauthorized recreational mitigation supplies, which apparently cost the HOA $3,872. I had a strong hunch that number included 2 steel locks, a chain, a laminated sign printer, and maybe Bob's bonus. But the deeper I went, the stranger it got. A $9,600 payment to a company called Coastal View Drones, LLC. A $3,200 consulting fee paid to an individual listed only as M. Lawson. And then a $12,000 reimbursement to Sarah herself for specialist review, shoreline consultation, and emergency ecology response. All approved without a general member vote. All marked as urgent discretionary disbursements. Discretionary my ass. I saved the PDFs and forwarded them to Jason, who, as it turned out, wasn't just a protective dad.
He was also a retired CPA with a very short temper for shady bookkeeping. That evening, he dropped a 17-page forensic breakdown in my inbox that made the HOA finances look less like a budget and more like the back ledger of a criminal enterprise. He highlighted 5 separate violations of the state's HOA financial transparency laws, including one that, if pursued, could result in civil penalties and mandatory board removal. That's when I realized Sarah hadn't just overstepped. She'd broken the very system that protected her, and all I had to do was push. I didn't go public yet, not immediately. I let the tension simmer. I kept smiling at Sarah at the mailbox. I kept waving at Bob as he did his pointless patrols. I kept my promise and took down the Crocodile sign, but left the parody one up. It was no longer just about animals. It was a warning about what happens when someone thinks they're untouchable. Meanwhile, I went door to door, politely, casually. I brought cookies to one house, offered to trim a branch for another. I never mentioned Sarah's name at first. I just asked how people felt about the HOA, and once they opened up, I showed them Jason's report. The reactions were priceless. One woman almost spit out her tea. A dad on Lakeside Drive high-fived me and said he'd been waiting for someone to take her down. My favorite was the old guy in the log cabin who said, "Finally, someone's got the guts. That woman fined me for painting my shutters brown. I'm legally colorblind." Within a week, I had a small army of supporters, all itching for action. So we gave them one. We scheduled a town hall, not under the HOA banner, but as an independent lakefront owners meeting. We rented out the high school cafeteria just outside HOA jurisdiction, posted flyers, sent out emails, and invited every resident who had ever been told their mulch wasn't up to code. The night of the meeting, the parking lot was overflowing. People were standing in the back and front, and center stage on a projection screen the size of a billboard was Jason's forensic report, titled in bold white letters, "Where Did Our Dues Go?" I opened with a calm, steady voice. I explained what we'd uncovered,
showing them the payment, the fake names, the drone contracts with no footage ever shared. I read the state statute aloud, the one that required a full financial review anytime over $5,000 was spent without a vote. And then I showed the receipt. The room erupted. People shouted. One woman demanded the police be called. Another guy stood up and said he was a lawyer and would personally help draft the civil complaint. Someone else asked if we could freeze HOA dues until we got answers. And through it all, I didn't raise my voice once. I let the anger build organically, because it wasn't just about money. It was about years of being bossed around by a petty tyrant with a spreadsheet and a superiority complex. Sarah didn't attend the meeting, of course, but she heard about it. Oh, she heard. She showed up on my porch the next morning at 6:45 a.m. wearing sunglasses and fury. No makeup, no clipboard, just rage barely contained behind a polyester tracksuit. "You've gone too far," she hissed. I sipped my coffee. "Good morning to you too, Sarah." "You can't call meetings. You can't distribute false reports. This is harassment." "False? So you're saying the budget report is fake? You're denying the $12,000 you reimbursed yourself?" She paused. Just a blink, but I caught it. "I was acting within emergency discretionary limits. Those limits cap at $500 per occurrence. You approved your own reimbursement for 24 times that. It was approved by the executive committee."
There is no executive committee, Sarah. You made that up. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her jaw twitched. She took a deep breath, visibly recalculating her strategy. "This isn't over," she said, turning to leave. "I know," I replied. "That's why I've already called the state HOA Oversight Division." She froze. For a moment, I thought she was going to faint, but she didn't. She just walked back to her car like she'd been deflated from the inside out. That afternoon, we filed the official complaint. A week later, 2 investigators from the State Oversight Board arrived in our neighborhood in unmarked suits. They didn't knock on my door. They didn't have to. I watched from my living room as they went directly to the HOA office. Sarah's car was parked out front. 2 hours later, it was gone. I didn't see her again for 3 days. When she finally resurfaced, she looked different. Not in a dramatic Hollywood villain way, hiding in the shadows, but just tired, smaller. Her hair was unbrushed, and she wasn't wearing her usual pastel armor. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. For the first time in my life, I actually felt a tiny flicker of sympathy for her. It lasted 5 seconds, because later that day, a memo went out, not from Sarah, but from the interim board president, a guy named Greg, who used to be her biggest yes man, until she fined him for hanging wind chimes. The memo was short and sweet. "As of this morning, Sarah Miller has voluntarily resigned her position as HOA Director of Lakeside Property Compliance, pending the results of a state financial review. Effective immediately, all discretionary powers are suspended, and the HOA Board will undergo mandatory audit procedures." Boom, she was out. But here's where it gets better. The crocodile sign. Remember that whole saga that started this mess? The board voted to keep it up. Why? Because apparently, while the state investigators were doing their thing, a drone scan picked up something large moving near the reeds. They couldn't confirm it was a crocodile, but they couldn't rule it out either. So the warning remained. And with Sarah gone, the dock was mine again. No locks, no citations, just peace, planks, and the occasional tourist paddling by, slowing down to read the sign. Sometimes they ask me if I've seen the crocodile. I smile and say, "Not yet." But I hear she wore a coral blouse. The morning after the resignation memo dropped, the neighborhood felt like it was celebrating a festival. People walked their dogs slower, as if hoping to bump into someone just to say, "Did you hear?" Lawn chairs appeared on porches that had been HOA starched and sterile for years. The HOA Facebook group changed its header to a stock photo of a smiling lake instead of the usual pixelated rules list.
It was as if Sarah's resignation had lifted some invisible pressure. Even the birds seemed to chirp a little louder. For the first time since I moved in, the place felt like a community instead of a gated cult with a landscaping fetish. But I didn't relax, not yet, because I knew something the others didn't. Sarah hadn't gone quietly. Voluntarily resigned was a nice way of saying she cut a deal before the investigation could pin her to anything serious. And people like Sarah don't vanish. They regroup. And sure enough, I didn't have to wait long for confirmation. 3 days after her departure, I received a letter in a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper that said, "You think this is over. It isn't." That was it. No signature, just bold Sarah font. Very Sarah. I chuckled at first. Classic scare tactic. But then I noticed something odd. My mailbox was unlocked. It's one of those newer models with a combination dial, and I always double-check it. The lock wasn't broken. It was just open, like someone knew the code. I changed the code that night. 2 days later, I woke up to find my dock soaked, not from rain. There hadn't been a drop in over a week, but from a garden hose carefully snaked from a nearby greenbelt.
My dock was drenched, and the crocodile warning sign was lying face down in the water, its stake uprooted and floating next to a soggy pile of what looked like half-melted gummy bears. I wasn't mad. I was impressed. This was petty sabotage executed with theatrical flair. Again, very Sarah. I checked my security cameras. Nothing. Either whoever did it avoided the angles, or they knew where the cameras were. That narrowed the suspect list. The next board meeting was scheduled for Thursday. Greg, the interim president, had promised transparency, a phrase that made some residents nervous and others euphoric. I arrived 10 minutes early to grab a good seat. The room was packed, mostly with curious residents, but a few faces stood out. Jenna and Olivia was sitting in the back, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd like secret agents waiting to flip their jackets open and reveal a badge. They weren't gone, just watching, waiting. Greg kicked off the meeting with some updates. The financial audit was ongoing, and the preliminary findings were, in his words, deeply concerning. At least $32,000 in HOA dues had been redirected to personal initiatives over an 18-month span. Several board members were cooperating. One had already resigned. Sarah, though no longer on the board, had lawyered up. Then he opened the floor for resident comments. I stood up. I didn't grandstand, I didn't gloat. I simply asked if the board was prepared to press charges should the audit confirm fraud. Greg said they were exploring all legal options. I nodded, thanked him, and sat down. But as I returned to my seat, I felt a pair of eyes lock onto me. I turned and saw Olivia. She wasn't glaring, she wasn't smirking. She was smiling, and not the friendly kind. The next day, my internet cut out. No storm, no maintenance, no outage in the area, just gone. I called the provider. They said someone had called in that morning and requested a temporary hold due to vacation travel. They gave the caller's name, Sarah M., from the household account. She had impersonated me. That was a felony. I hung up and filed a report. The officer was polite but skeptical. Got any proof she did it? I explained everything. The history, the feud, the lock, the sign, the budget, the resignation, the mailbox, the hose, the gummy bears, the internet call. I even showed him the anonymous letter. He nodded slowly, taking notes. Then he asked the one question I wasn't prepared for. Why not just move? I blinked. Because it's my land. He shrugged. Sometimes that's not enough. And just like that, I understood the real stakes. This wasn't just an HOA drama anymore. This was a war of attrition. Sarah wasn't trying to beat me with fines or policies anymore. She was trying to wear me down, break my routines, chip away at my peace until I voluntarily surrendered. And that meant she still had loyalists. I started looking at everyone differently. The neighbor who always waved but never spoke, the jogger who passed my house every morning with AirPods and a hoodie, the landscaping guy who always mowed right up to the edge of my property but never crossed over. I didn't trust anyone, so I went nuclear, not in anger, but in strategy. I called Jason. Together, we drafted a motion to dissolve the existing HOA and replace it with a voluntary community association, one that operated solely through opt-in participation and offered actual benefits, not just restrictions. We framed it around transparency, fairness, and resident choice, and then we began gathering signatures. It wasn't easy. Jenna and Olivia launched a whisper campaign the second they caught wind. They said we were trying to destroy the neighborhood, that we wanted to let anarchists park RVs on front lawns, that we were opening the gates to short-term rentals and chicken coops. One flyer literally said they want to bring back the gators. I couldn't make that up if I tried, but the truth resonated louder, and little by little, the numbers climbed. We needed 58 signatures to trigger a community-wide vote. We got 74.
The vote was scheduled for the following month. Until then, Sarah had one last card to play. The week before the vote, I received a letter from the County Code Enforcement Office. It was a formal citation stating that my dock was in violation of shoreline setback regulations due to unpermitted modifications. Specifically, the Crocodile warning sign had allegedly been bolted into the sediment below the high water line, violating wetlands protections. I nearly laughed. It wasn't even bolted. It was staked. But then I saw the enclosed photo. It was my dock, the sign, a timestamp, and a clear view of the stake going below water level. Someone had taken it on purpose and submitted it with a fabricated complaint. The fine was $2,000, payable within 14 days. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with HOA politics anymore. This had become personal, calculated, and strategic. Sarah was trying to bury me under paperwork, fines, paranoia, and stress. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd made me care. Before all this, I just wanted to live in peace, use my dock, paddle my canoe, watch the sunset. But now I wanted every last one of her levers ripped out of the ground and tossed into the lake. So I called a friend of mine, a lawyer who specialized in land use law. I explained everything. He reviewed the citation and immediately flagged it. The photo, it had metadata. The timestamp was doctored. And the angle, taken from a drone, an illegal one if it was flying below the residential roofline without permission. He drafted a response letter, we filed a counter-complaint, and then I did something I'd been saving for just the right moment. I printed out a high-resolution copy of the photo and added a caption across the bottom in red letters, "Who's really watching?" By Monday morning, the neighborhood was in chaos, though not the kind Sarah had hoped for. The anonymously mailed photo, with its eerie red caption, had detonated like a psychological bomb. Suddenly, everyone was asking the same question. Who took the photo? Who had access to that drone? And who had been watching us this whole time? The HOA message board went into full meltdown mode. Threads popped up accusing each other of surveillance. One resident swore they saw a quadcopter hovering over their grill 2 weeks ago. Another claimed their kid's kite was buzzed mid-air by a gray drone with flashing blue lights. Someone even suggested Bob had a secret surveillance van and lived under the clubhouse. Within 48 hours, paranoia spread like an algae bloom. Sarah's loyalists, what remained of them, began to fracture. Jenna posted a long-winded defense of proactive neighborhood safety measures and was promptly booted from 3 Facebook subgroups. Olivia, ever the silent hawk, stopped showing up entirely. The community had turned on itself, but not in the way Sarah had planned. Her empire wasn't just collapsing, it was eating itself from the inside out. Meanwhile, I kept my head down and my hands clean. I didn't post, I didn't comment, I didn't gloat. I just kept organizing. The upcoming vote to dissolve the HOA had become more than just a referendum. It was a revolution, a quiet, methodical rebellion, and I was playing it like chess. Then came the unexpected twist. A man named Victor showed up at my door.
Late 50s, gray beard, cargo shorts, sunglasses with a strap looped behind his neck like a dad who'd just come back from a fishing trip. He introduced himself as a former HOA board member from the pre-Sarah era. I invited him in. He got right to the point. "You're doing the right thing," he said, sipping the glass of water I offered. "I tried to stop her 2 years ago. Thought if I'd just ride it out, she'd burn out on her own. But she's smarter than she looks, or at least meaner." He reached into his pocket and slid a flash drive across the table. "This has every internal email, vote record, and expenditure from the last 2 years, including some that never made it to the resident portal." I raised an eyebrow. "How did you get these?" He smiled faintly. "Let's just say I kept backups as insurance in case she ever turned on me." I plugged the drive into my laptop after he left. What I found was damning. Votes passed with fake timestamps, expense reports redacted manually, and emails in which Sarah referred to residents as vermin, compliance liabilities, and in one case, soggy burrito brains. But the crown jewel? A forwarded email chain between Sarah and a company called Eyeline Aerial Services, the drone contractor, attached with an invoice for targeted residential surveillance, specifically referencing 3 properties, mine included, that alone could bury her. So I called Greg. We set up an emergency board meeting, not to discipline Sarah, she was technically out of reach now, but to present the evidence to the entire community and let them decide what to do next. The goal wasn't revenge, it was clarity, closure, and ultimately power back in the hands of the people who'd paid for every bad decision she'd made. The meeting was held at the same high school cafeteria as before. This time we brought a projector, 2 wireless mics, and chairs for everyone.
Greg opened with brief remarks, then handed me the mic. I didn't waste time. I laid out the timeline. The locks, the false citations, the falsified financial records, the surveillance drone, the photo metadata. I showed the residents exactly how they'd been manipulated, watched, and billed for the privilege. I let them read Sarah's emails aloud. The audience gasped. Some laughed, some cursed. The anger had crystallized into something sharper. Resolve. Then came the vote. A simple paper ballot. Yes or no? Shall the Lakeside HOA be dissolved and replaced with a voluntary neighborhood association with no enforcement authority? Final count? 64 yes, 8 no, 3 abstained. Just like that, the HOA died. That night, I walked back to my dock. No lock, no warning signs, no surveillance, just moonlight bouncing off the water like it was finally allowed to breathe again. But the story doesn't end there. A month later, I received a certified letter from the county prosecutor's office. They were pursuing criminal charges against Sarah for fraud, misappropriation of funds, and unlawful surveillance. Her former board allies had either turned on her or gone underground. I heard rumors she was living in a condo 3 towns over, working part-time at a real estate agency that specialized in foreclosures. Poetic. I wasn't out for blood, but I did attend the preliminary hearing. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just reduced. Like someone who had spent so long pretending to have power that she forgot what it felt like to be truly powerless. When the judge read the charges, she didn't speak, just nodded, eyes low, face pale. I left the courtroom before the bail decision. I had no interest in watching her squirm. She wasn't the story anymore. Back home, the voluntary community group began to flourish. We organized a shared tool shed, set up a neighborhood library box, held a summer barbecue where everyone brought something and nobody measured the grass height. Greg became the de facto community coordinator, and I somehow became the guy people came to with questions, not because I had authority, but because I listened. As for the dock, it's become a bit of a landmark. People paddle over just to see where it all started. A few ask if the Crocodile sign is still up, and I smile and say no. It was retired, framed, and now hangs in my hallway next to the HOA's final budget printout.
One morning, a family of otters took over the reeds near the end of the dock. I named the biggest one Sarah. It felt appropriate. She barked a lot, stole fish from the others, and spent most of her time alone. Fitting. There's peace now. Not just the quiet kind, but the deeper kind that settles in your bones after a long, exhausting storm. The kind that says you stood your ground. You played the long game. You didn't flinch, and you won. Because sometimes the best way to beat a crocodile isn't to wrestle it. It's to put up a sign, let it think it's scary, and then build something better behind it. The dock is open. The water's calm.
So what do you think? Was the best way to deal with Sarah's manipulation the peaceful approach, or do you think more drastic action was needed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.